Hey, welcome back to episode 2 of the UFC Cutting Room Floor. This is covering the month of June. We are back slightly later than I'd like. I mean, normally I want to try to do this on the 1st or the 2nd, but I'm guessing the holiday weekend kind of screwed up the UFC's data entry team and they didn't end up cutting everyone or, updating their website with who they cut until last night. Uh, on that note, too, just because I'm kind of talking about this and I don't know, I guess what would be a little bit of a cavalier manner. I'll just get this out of the way right up front. I'm not reveling in the UFC cutting any fighters. I don't. That's that sucks for them, and I get that. And I'm not. This isn't like a glorifying the guys that the UFC let go kind of show. It's just that's kind of the nature of sports. You sign up for a career based on your athletic ability and your performance, and people want to know, where you're going to be fighting and when and who. And the UFC doesn't really make a big public statement out of it, and a lot of fighters don't make public statements out of it. So the best we can go on is when they update their website, when they turn over, when they sort of do their monthly overhaul of their active roster, then we at least have what we can assume to be some idea of who just got the boot and who didn't, other than the fighters who announced it earlier themselves. So, this is really just kind of an informational thing. I'm not trying to be happy about anybody losing their jobs. I just want to be able to tell, I want fans to be able to know who they can expect to be in the UFC. I mean, I think that's a valuable thing. If you were watching your favorite team, you would want to know who's going to be on the field. That's kind of where I stand. So this month, while the news came a little late, we have a whole bunch of cuts. They really decided to just kind of empty things out and clear things out. It's an interesting shift from past months. I think for the past couple of years they were on an expansion program where they were signing 20 or 30 fighters a month and cutting like 5 or 10. And then for like the first 6 months of this year, they were on more of a, sign 5 or 6 and cut 10 a month. So suddenly they were kind of contracting. And this month we saw they signed 16 guys, they cut 16 guys. So could be that they've got things just kind of where they want them, and for everybody signed, they're going to be cutting people. I don't know how much that'll hold up, but definitely over the last year, they've been much more in a stasis, signing as many guys as they cut or cutting as many guys as they sign kind of thing. They're not really expanding at nearly the rate they were over the past couple of years. So on that note, let's get down to this month's cuts. If you go all the way back early in the month, Luke Barnett, he got cut after his loss to Mark Munoz. Kind of a surprising cut for a short notice release. At the same time, he was a fighter that had been, I don't know if regressing is the right word, but it seems like he kind of tore down his style to do something new and was not, while he was in the middle of tearing that down, things have not been going well. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him back in the UFC at some point, but for now, he's on the outside. Also, Brian Ebersol retired. That made big public news a little while ago. After his latest loss to Omari Akhmadov, he hung him up. So that's not, it's not so much a cut as it is that he's not fighting anymore. Similarly, Josh Koscheck is recently announced a Bellator signing. His cut, he was not one of the names released off the roster this month, interestingly, but he's very obviously no longer with the UFC. So that's kind of an interesting side note. And part of the problems of trying to keep up with the UFC's roster is that they will regularly, big cuts or movement, roster movement, guys leaving, guys coming on will be made publicly known, but never updated on their website. The UFC website's full of stuff like that. I think they still have profiles for guys like Anthony Hardonk and Shane Carwin and Tito Ortiz and even Hoist Gracie. So there's all sorts of mess like that that Josh Koscheck is now gets to be part of for a little while longer. And finally, just before this big run of cuts last night, Diego Lima got released after going 1-3 since his Ultimate Fighter finale performance, where he got knocked out by Eddie Gordon. He won one fight after that, and then lost his last two. And yeah, I mean that just I don't know how well he's going to bounce back regionally, just because his problems seem to be kind of related to his chin and his ability to take damage, and that's not something that might necessarily improve wherever he goes. He could certainly be back with a few wins, but he may end up being one of those guys that immediately goes down to the regionals, faces that hot young prospect looking to make a name for himself, and gets knocked out again. So I don't know. Now getting into the big run of cuts from yesterday. Uh, Working down, we had light heavyweight Ryan Jimmo got released. That was a pretty big name cut for the UFC. Jimmo is somebody who'd been very publicly critical of the Reebok deal. I know a lot of fans have been sort of chalking his release up to that. But I mean, it's also, Jimmo was not outside of his, if he wasn't getting an immediate knockout, Jimmo has not been an exciting fighter for the UFC. He has two, sub 1 round KOs in the UFC, and otherwise it's either he has one ugly decision and then four ugly losses. His loss to Francimar Barbosa, I realized there was a really bad groin kick in there that seemed to affect his. I don't know if it affected his performance quite a bit, but it certainly seemed to affect him mentally quite a bit. I mean, he seemed like he was thrown up in the cage, and it looked like it hurt a lot, but it didn't. I mean, he was still he's been known for being a lackluster fighter that doesn't really have a lot of aggression. He likes to pot shot, likes to grind against the cage, likes to just kind of try and eke out rounds. Not a fighter that the UFC would be eager to promote. And then the fact that he's been a vocally critical fighter of the UFC as well puts him on incredibly thin ice. So it's hard to be surprised when a guy like him gets cut. Other than Jimmo, so it's moving down into the welterweight division, because Luke Barnett was our only middleweight, I believe. Cut a bunch of welterweights. Luis Dutra is gone after going 0-2. He was injured on the Ultimate Fighter, had to wait a long time. Lost his debut against Kichi Kunamoto due to illegal elbows, and then fought a pretty good young prospect coming out. I'm trying to remember who that was. He fought Tom Breeze, that's right, in his last bout. And Breeze is just kind of a physically huge welterweight, real beast. And Breeze knocked him out. And I think Dutra's kind of one of those unfortunate cases of a guy who he just never was really able to stay healthy enough and to train consistently enough to become as talented as he might have been. He started his career way back in 2003, but he's only fought 16 times in his career. He's now in his 30s, and I was hearing recently that he was just now being able to sort of train full time and really commit himself. But unfortunately, it may have just been kind of too late, and that feels really unfortunate for a guy like Dutra, who was really trying to put it all together for years, only to run up against some really bad matchups right at the point that he was starting to figure things out. Along with Dutra at welterweight, the UFC cut Wendell Oliveira, another Brazilian, somebody that I know some Brazilian pundits and some fans had a lot of hope in. He was a really great regional welterweight on the Brazilian scene, been around forever, fought everybody. And I mean, he seems like a case of a guy who maybe just didn't quite have the physical durability, the toughness to survive in the UFC. Great power puncher, not an unskilled fighter, but somebody who was known for being kind of a willing striker, somebody who could trade with people and go after guys and get the knockout, and who has just been run over by the UFC competition. Guys who are tougher than him, guys who can wade in and take his shots, can return fire, and he can't take theirs. So, especially somebody like Darren Till, who, while a finisher, really hadn't fought a lot of great competition. was really kind of not a prospect I think people expected necessarily to really thrive against Oliveira, and eventually Till just kind of took him down and knocked him out. And when you're getting knocked out by guys like that, and when every aggressive, tough fighter that comes after you is KOing you, then I'm not surprised that Oliveira's out of the UFC at this point. It's too bad. He was on a really great run up until he got to the UFC, but I would be surprised to see him back. Also out of the UFC at welterweight, Andrew Todd Hunter, really promising welterweight prospect. Guy I had a lot of interest in. I think he's one of the better welterweight prospects. Actually, I think he's one of the better middleweight prospects out there, I should say. I scouted him middleweight, thought he would look like a great middleweight. Decided to come into the UFC on welterweight at short notice. He'd fought a catchweight at 175 before, but he'd never fought at 170. Decided to try and make the cut, missed weight, had his fight canceled at the last minute because he passed out. And unfortunately for him, that is sort of like an ultimate sin, I think, in Joe Silva's eyes. I've heard him talk about it before, how much he wants guys to be professional, and how he views making weight and showing up for the fight as being like the baseline professionalism that you have to achieve. And so I think, Todd Hunter got cut without even debuting in the UFC, and it's not hard to see why when you consider that he said he could take a short notice fight at welterweight and then he didn't make weight. It sucks because I think he's a fantastic prospect. He's got a really bright future ahead of him, and he's somebody that I think the UFC should have kept and built up over time. He was, a good fighter who has a lot of potential, but he just kind of he burned a bridge on this short notice contract. Whether or not that keeps him out of the UFC for a long term, I don't know. I hope not. Maybe he can go to Bellator, get some fights, and work a contract over there, something like that. But it's too bad. It's just kind of a bad set of circumstances for him, taking a short notice fight like that at a weight division that he wasn't used to and not making it. Let's see. Yeah, their other welterweight cuts were we already talked about Lima and Koscheck and Ebersol. Lightweight lost a couple fighters. Justin Edwards, who I was kind of surprised the UFC kept around as long as he did. He went for a 2-5 record with the promotion, and honestly, he's a fighter I think really had improved over his time with the UFC. It was just that he also kept getting slightly more difficult matchups as he got better. Or the fighters that he was fighting were also improving. He beat Josh Neer and George Lopez, but then he fought Brandon Thatch, and then he fought Ramsey Nijam, and then he fought Joe Proctor. And that's not a murderer's row, but it's the kind of thing where even though Edwards had been getting better over his MMA career, it just wasn't enough to make up for some of for really an athletic differential. He's just not an amazing athlete. He's still he's not a young fighter at 32, but he's kind of right in his prime right now, which is a tough time to be cut from the UFC. But hopefully he can get to another major promotion really quick and get some good fights, because these are probably the best years of his career on a 3-fight losing streak, and that's a tough time to be entering into those years. Let's see. Also at lightweight was Zhongli Peng. I don't know. This is kind of a sign of the UFC's ongoing, to me at least, it's a sign of the UFC's ongoing lack of interest in keeping up their China market, keeping up their fighters that they brought over from tough China. Zhongli Peng, not an amazing talent, but a developing fighter, like somebody they brought in who was really just kind of known as being a tough brawler, a guy who was either needed to be the better athlete in the cage, or he was going to get beat up. And I think he's been improving on that a bit, but kind of like the Justin Edwards situation, it's that idea of improving while everybody else is still better than you. And I don't know. I'm not surprised he got cut, but it does suck that the UFC's really just kind of, they brought in all these Chinese fighters with the idea that they were going to really develop some talent out of there, and just isn't happening at all. They lost both their welterweight finalists now. I mean, I believe Wong Sai is gone. He may not be, but he's fighting for Kunlun fight. They signed him to a contract without ever having his UFC release announced or shown up or anything like that. So it may just be one of those things where he's taking fights at an outside organization because it's China and what's the UFC going to do? Or it could be that he just waited out his UFC contract and is gone. Either way, they don't have either their welterweight finalists, and they only have one of their bantamweight finalists now in Ning Guang Yu. I would be surprised if, other than Guang Yu and Li Jinglong, who they brought in at the same time, sort of apart, that they keep any of the rest of those fighters off that show. Now down to featherweight, the cut, and this is the sort of the center point for the show for me in this whole list. They cut Hatsu Hioki, which is not surprising. It's not a bad thing. It's not an undeserved thing. But it feels like was like the final goodbye in what has been a very long farewell to Hatsu Hioki for me. This is somebody that I think it was after the Clay Guida loss. I just kind of threw up my hands and was like, well, I'm never really getting too excited about a Hatsu Hioki fight again. And even people thought he won that fight, and I would not argue heavily with them that he didn't. But it was just kind of indicative of this idea that he's really not going to thrive in the UFC. And we're talking about somebody who was seen as a title contender. So it's not like, oh, well, Clay Guida is a good fighter. Yeah, I know Clay Guida is a good fighter, but you're talking about somebody that you hoped would compete for a belt walking in. He was ranked, people were super high on him, thought that he could be a title contender for Jose Aldo. He even turned down a title shot against Aldo and then went 1-5. And it just, his game was not made for a bigger class of featherweight and a better class of wrestler. And his final loss, knockout to Dan Hooker, was just kind of sad. I mean, for fans that were holding out any hope, he was even winning that fight. And when you see a fighter who's winning a fight and then still gets knocked out, it really just suggests that, maybe things are really on the decline. He's been fighting since 2002, so he's been around for 13 years, and he's started losing fights that he really, I don't think anybody expected him to lose that kind of fight. And so him getting cut was just kind of the last farewell in Hatsu Hioki's super disappointing UFC run. After Hioki, they cut a trio of flyweights. Josh Sampo, who I really expected better things out of in the UFC. I thought that he was a pretty good sort of action wrestle boxer outside the UFC, somebody I expected would have a fair bit of success and be a tough, like, win one, lose one kind of test for fighters, a gatekeeper talent. But things just really haven't clicked for him. He's not fast enough for flyweight, it seems like. That's a division that thrives on being an incredibly quick athlete. You have to be able to track guys down. You can't be foot slow. You can't wade in. You can't chase. You have to be super on the ball at all times. And guys like Scoggins and Houlihan and Makovsky, they may not necessarily be as technically gifted as Sampo in some areas with wrestling and grappling and things like that. Makovsky certainly is. But they were just way faster than him. And that's a tough place to be at flyweight. Once again, he's another fighter who's kind of like right now entering his prime and getting cut. So it'll be interesting to see where he goes. Could be back with another couple of wins if he can turn around quickly, but it's a tough position to be in because it's not early enough in your career to rebuild, and you're not coming out with a lot of name value that you built up over years in the UFC where you can go and get some big headline fights for other organizations off that name value. So it's a tough place. Along with him, Bentley Seiler was cut, tough Latin America fighter. great name, but a lot of the tough Latin American guys just really weren't ready for the UFC at all. Siler came up against Freddie Serrano, who was just 5 levels above him athletically and just blitzed him out of the UFC in, you know, pretty brutal fashion. So Siler, I would be surprised to see Siler back in the UFC. I just think that he was the product of a regional system that is not producing athletes ready to compete at this level. And Nolan Tickman, who a lot of people argued won his last fight, a King's MMA fighter, a good athletic prospect, but not somebody who just is. It seems like he's not prepared to fight in a style that wins him rounds in the UFC. He's definitely a prospect that could turn around and come back and be great, down the line, get a couple of wins, come right back. Even though he's been fighting for quite a while, he's had some injuries, but he's only got 7 pro fights, so he's in his 20s. He's only got 7 pro fights. I'm not sure that he's quite at that, like, he should be peaking right now. This is the best he can do. It still feels like he's a fighter very much developing all of his skills. He may be somebody that kind of blooms late in his career, and he just wasn't, he had this very counter, try to land big counter shots, always on his back foot, always moving backwards, never putting together combinations, and his footwork really wasn't good enough to maintain that style. And against Yao Kui, it cost him a really ugly decision, and it was just like, you can't constantly give up volume and give up range and basically give up aggression to your opponent in the UFC and win, especially not when you had the physical advantages that Tickman obviously had over Jiqui. Every time they locked up, Tickman was just able to throw him around, but never kept him down, never worked him over on the ground, never stayed consistent with his wrestling, never did the things that you kind of expect to win rounds. After that, we also have 2 women's strawweights cut. Lisa Ellis, who I believe, let's see, who did she lose to last? She lost to Beck Rawlings last at the Adelaide event. And unfortunately, it just does not seem like she's the caliber of athlete who can compete in strawweight. She's been around for a long time, classic vet of the sport. And I think the athletic ceiling of women's MMA has just passed her by. Fighters like Rawlings and Herrig, who are aggressive and strong, and even if they're not the most technical or the most stellar athletes, were just a lot more powerful than Ellis. So not surprised at that cut. I will say I'm a little sad to see Jessica Rakoczy go. I think almost more than any other fighter on this list. Oh, I did skip Robbie Peralta, so I'll get back to Robbie Peralta in a minute. But I actually would say I'm sadder to see Jessica Rakoczy go more than any other fight on this list. She came out recently against Valerie Letourneau after a long layoff. I'm not even sure why she was out so long, but after a long layoff, she came out, fought Valerie Letourneau, and looked really good. Like, she looked like she had picked up a lot of tools. She looked like she'd really expanded her game a lot, was very competitive, is still a relatively inexperienced fighter, even if she's not a young fighter. And it just seemed like there was a lot of room for growth there, somebody to develop in a young division, somebody who had the athletic ability to compete for a couple of years more in that division. So I'm kind of sad to see her go. Which turns me back around to Robbie Peralta, who I overlooked. Robbie Peralta, I think, is the fighter who's been on a lot of people's names as the undeserved cut of this cycle. And I don't know. I think the raw numbers don't disagree with that. Certainly beating guys like Hani Jason. Well, Hani Jason's really his best win, which was a split decision. But beating Hani Jason, it seems like that should maybe get you a little more leeway. He's been a fun action fighter for the UFC, But I think he's also just kind of been a fighter that has been around for a long time now, in the UFC and Strikeforce. He's been around since 2011. He's been around for 4 years. And while he's won some fights, he's just not shown a lot of improvement. I mean, his fights against Tavares and Guida really showed that, that was sort of like the first time that he'd really been put up against good wrestlers and grapplers again after a long time. I mean, Honey Jason is a good grappler, but he's not a great wrestler. So, not like Tavares. Tavares is a much more consistent fighter in that sense. And when those fighters got in there with him, you know, Peralta just still had no wrestling. He still had no ground game. He's still a great athlete, and he's still like a fun brawler. But definitely, I don't know. Like, I don't know that I would necessarily argue that Peralta deserved to be cut. I don't think he did. He had a 4-3 and 1, or 5-3 if you include his strike force bout, and 1 no contest record under Zuffa. It's a pretty good record, but I'm not necessarily that sad to see Robbie Peralta go. I don't know. I just, he's, like I say, I'm not trying to revel in anything, but I think if you're looking at, like, is this a fighter that's going to go out and who's been around for 4 or 5 years now, and is he making a run at the top 15? Just doesn't seem like that's where Peralta is. He's in a bit of a hard spot too. He's been around since 2007, so we're talking 8 years into his career, really, like, supposedly at his best in his late 20s, and now cut. It'd be interesting to see if he has enough name value out of his UFC career to turn around and go to Bellator, or go to maybe Titan, someplace like that, get some wins. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. I don't know if Peralta comes back or not. He's really, I think of Peralta as sort of the classic case of how far can a fighter go with great athletic potential and without really ever being in that kind of consistent environment that really takes advantage of his potential, really putting together the training that makes somebody with his athletic ability a great fighter. And he took himself a long way with that. So it'll be interesting to see what he does outside the UFC, and if they bring him right back when they need a short notice featherweight. I certainly could see him being the kind of guy that gets called up the moment that the UFC needs somebody, a replacement for a US featherweight injury or something like that. That covers the cuts. Like I say, there was a lot of them this month. I figure I'd go back now over the signings of the last month too. I don't want to get into July. They've already signed 6 fighters in July, but I'll save that for next show. But just talk about the guys who came in over June, because there's another 16. Like I say, we lost 16 over the last month. We gained 16 over the last month. Starting out, we saw Steve Kennedy debuted. He did not look great. Regional Australian welterweight, made his debut against now I'm forgetting. Made his debut against Peter Sabota, and Sabota just kind of schooled him. It was a late notice fight. I wouldn't, be surprised if Kennedy looks a little better next time out, but not a great debut. The UFC re-signed Reza Madadi after his jail term, the Swedish lightweight. So now that he's out of jail, he's back in the UFC, which is kind of an interesting statement for them to make. He's always proclaimed his innocence, so I'm not commenting heavily on that, but he was a very popular fighter in Sweden. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what cards he's on coming up here, and how soon we see him get a fight. He doesn't have anything announced yet. They signed Jessica Aguilar, of course, who's fighting Claudia Gadelha coming up for what is likely the next shot at Joanna Jędrzejczyk's belt. Long-time proclaimed #1 strawweight in the world. I'm not sure how well that holds up at this point, but it'll be interesting to see how she does against Gadelha, and if she gets herself back up into a title shot. They brought back they've been bringing back some tough Latin America fighters for some second fights that I'm honestly a little surprised about Guido Canetti got brought back for another fight. So I'm a little surprised about that, especially cutting Bentley Seiler the way they did. Canetti may be a better prospect long term for them, but I'm still a little, I don't know, not. I'm a little surprised that they brought those guys back because usually tough fighters, when they lose one bout off the season and in the UFC, they just tend to be gone. They brought in Tough Brazil, just got done. Finalists are Glico Franca and Fernando Bruno at lightweight. Franca is a really good athletic prospect. I really like, he's one of those guys I think who has developed late as a great athlete learning the game. So he did really well in the show. I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up winning his bout and becoming a tough champ off that. And Delano Lopez and Reginaldo Vieira at bantamweight, and Lopez I think is definitely going to be the favorite there. He's been a long time uh, talent prospect coming up at bantamweight. So they've also brought in over last month one of the better light heavyweight prospects in the world, Misha Serkinov, somebody who was scouted out by Bloody Elbow way back in 2011. Serkinov was scouted out as a top light heavyweight prospect. He was a great judoka and amateur judoka and wrestler on the Canadian circuit. As a teen, went to what's Extreme Couture in Toronto and became, to work on his grappling, and became a really good no-gi grappler on the Canadian circuit as well. And it's just like sort of a grappling phenom in MMA. Really smooth, slick, powerful, big fighter. I mean, it's one of the rare things for a light heavyweight is that he's somebody that is light heavyweight sized. I hope he doesn't drop to middleweight like so many guys do, because he's big enough and strong enough and powerful enough to be a good light heavyweight. And there aren't honestly a lot of great light heavyweight grapplers. So it's a skill set that I think he could really use to school some guys. They brought in Arnold Allen, who had a great debut as a featherweight and really showed up for a short notice fight against Alan Omer, put on a great performance. He's considered to be a top featherweight prospect by a lot of people. Had a fantastic debut. I'm excited to see more of him. And of course, they brought in a whole slew of people, of which Arnold Allen was one, for that tough finale, or that what was supposed to be a tough Brazil finale, which did not include any tough Brazil fighters. They brought in Joe Merritt, who got beat by Alex Oliveira, and Luis Gonzalez, who got beat by Leandro Silva. Tony Sims and Steve Montgomery, who fought each other, and Tony Sims looks really good, slick hands, good boxer. I almost consider it like we saw Alex Oliveira beat KJ Noons recently in the sort of like, oh, is KJ Noons really the same action fighter he used to be? And Tony Sims is stepping up to maybe exactly fill that hole that KJ Noons might be leaving, as another slick, powerful boxer who is just well-rounded enough to be a competitive action fighter at that with that style. Montgomery, on the other hand, is a fighter I don't know. I like Montgomery. I hope he does well, but especially guys, big punchers, guys who have fast hands, they've caused a lot of problems for Montgomery in his career, and they did again here. It'll be interesting to see what he can do if he gets another fight, which I assume he will, how well he bounces back from that. And they brought in Serwan Kakai for his short notice bout against Danny Martinez. Kakai did well in that. He's already booked again, so we'll see how well he does down the road. And finally, to round out the June signings, they brought in Lyman Good, who has his debut coming up here against Andrew Craig. Good was on tough. He didn't do very well. He was former Bellator champ. Really, kind of a massive welterweight, coming as an MMA native out of Tiger Schulman, with like a very sort of brawling takedown, ground and pound kind of style. Decent fighter, not necessarily. It's never quite seemed to. Things haven't never quite seemed to click with him as well as they could for kind of a brawl and ground and pound guy. But it'll be interesting to see. He's coming to the UFC kind of, late in his career. It'll be interesting to see what kind of mark he makes. Anyway, that's all the roster movement for the month of June, which there was a ton of. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I'll be back next month, hopefully on the 1st or the 2nd, depending on how quickly the UFC gets their roster updates done. I will be back to do another one of these. Might bring on a guest if I can get one. Otherwise, just kind of doing the same thing, talking over all the roster movement, getting everybody up to date on just who's gone and who's in and why. So thanks for tuning in. Remember, you can find me on Twitter at TheZaneSimon, on Bloody Elbow, and give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to MMANation.com over on YouTube to get all the rest of our video content. Stay tuned. We've got all sorts of vivisections and care don't cares and 6th rounds and live fight coverage for 2 weeks of just tons of fights. UFC's got, I think, 5 events in 2 weeks, 4 in 8 days. Tons to cover, tons to go over. So be sure to follow along with all that for all of our video and written coverage and all that stuff. So thanks for tuning in, everyone, and see you next month.